All right, thank you so much for joining us again. We have our final panel for the day. Hope everyone got coffee, water. If you need anything, feel free to step out and get it. So just a few reminders. If you have posted to social media for the Lincoln Center tickets, your odds are so strong right now. So post away. And we also want to thank Tony's for providing so much incredible, delicious chocolate. Honestly, can't think of a better thing to describe it than an incredible treat, so thank you. And Karen, who was our friend that made that happen, is also a co-founder of Solarpunks, so excited to have the Solarpunks family here. And just so you know too, so after this, we'll have a quick break, grab some fresh air. We'll try to keep the doors open as long as we can for this session. And then we'll end the day with a talk with Spencer Levy, who's the Global Client Strategist and Senior Economic Advisor for CBRE. He's also a podcast host, so incredibly lively and funny and full of hot takes. And he's actually recording a podcast episode with Andrew, who was on stage earlier in the room next door. So Spencer will be joining us at 4:30. And so without any further ado, I'd love to introduce my colleague Emma, who helped and really drove making this whole panel come together. So Emma, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Hi everyone, I'm excited to introduce our next panel, Accelerating Progress to Net Zero. Cities account for more than 70% of global emissions, and many across the world are committing to achieving carbon zero by 2050. However, 99% of future city visualizations look nothing like our cities today, and the question remains, what will the future city really look like? In this panel, our distinguished speakers will explore how we will adapt our centuries-old buildings and urban systems to meet our modern energy and tech needs while producing no excess CO2. Our moderator, Bill Bram, is a professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he previously served as department chair and chair of the Faculty Senate, and is currently the director of the Masters of Environmental Building Design and of the Center for Environmental Building and Design. He has worked on energy and architecture for over 35 years as a designer, a consultant, a researcher, and an author of numerous articles and books. Please join me in welcoming Bill and our panelists.
Welcome everybody. Am I on? Welcome everybody. So I'm not going to read the bios of all of our participants because it would simply take too much time. You all have the internet. You all know how to find out who people are. But what I am going to do by way of asking them to introduce themselves is to ask them to briefly say what form of decarbonization or what approach to decarbonization they're taking and what that will look like when they succeed. What's the dream that they're working on? And I'll start on my immediate right with Donna.
Well, I'm Don McGraw from the City of Philadelphia. I work in the Office of Sustainability. I'm the Deputy Director of Energy Services and Operations. So in my role, my team oversees energy procurement and energy programs across the city's portfolio. For us, we have our municipal energy master plan and our goals for 2030. And in that is moving forward with, ensuring 100% renewable electricity procurement. So we're working towards that goal. I think we're definitely on track to meet that. So success for us would be full renewable electricity by 2030. I'm feeling really good about the progress we're making.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christian Kunkel. I work with BlocPower, and I'm the Director of Data Acquisition and Partnerships. So what that practically means at the micro level, what our company does is we decarbonize by electrifying buildings, specifically low-income multifamily buildings. And at the macro level, what I'm involved in is trying to understand as much as we can about every building in the entire country so that we can figure out which ones are the best fits for electrification. My dream scenario at the micro level would be every building is fully electric. And at the macro level, it would be, I want to know absolutely everything about the dimension, sizing, age, systems in place, and how much energy is being used in every building.
I'm, is this on? Dustin, okay. David Klatt, I'm a co-founder of Logical Buildings. We are energy efficiency and virtual power plant tech for the built world. I would define decarbonization in a few steps, and then I'll explain what our role is in it. Number one, we think that every building should use less, be more energy efficient all the time. Then in terms of what energy you're using, use more electricity, and we'll talk about why. Use that electricity smarter. And then whatever electricity is finally left over, procure renewable electricity. In terms of where we play a role, we do a lot in the first and third step. So as a software company, we help building operators and buildings of all shapes and sizes use less energy all the time. And then as a virtual power plant provider, we help all different types of energy users, big and small, earn revenue for using less energy at specific times. In terms of what my big picture, what success looks like, I would just say that every single energy user is a slightly more intelligent energy user and can be a little bit more price responsive. And it's pretty amazing when you think about it, like what other goods do you use and purchase without knowing how much you're using or the price at which you're using it or the carbon that's embedded in the electricity that you're using as an example. So I'd say mass market, slightly smarter energy users.
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second to ask you to define what a virtual power plant is.
Yeah, so virtual power plant is a fancy term in the energy space of which we have a lot, which really just I would say means price responsive energy users. And so if you think about it like this, if you like when you use Uber and it's New Year's Eve. You generally, if it's 11 o'clock on New Year's Eve, you know that an Uber is going to be 10 times more expensive. So maybe you want to go somewhere at 10 p.m., a little bit earlier or a little bit later. And that's really how I would describe a virtual power plant, where energy users can actually just respond to a price signal from the electric grid or the electric utility. That could be storage, it could be a building automation system. Could be any number of energy resources.
Great, thank you. There'll be a few of those interruptions, I'm sure. So Christina.
There we go. Hi. I'm Christina. I'm the co-founder of Solarpunks. It's an organization that started off with a really simple goal of reducing fossil fuel usage in creative industries like live music, events, film, and more. And through that process, we've been prototyping solutions with a mix of battery storage and solar gear for projects with clients ranging from the NFL to Nike, Burning Man, Desert X, and more. And from that, started realizing that we had some interesting solutions that had a lot of implications for urban planning, real estate, and beyond. And so I would say my North Star here, our goal, is basically moving away from our current very top-down hyper-monolithic petrol industrial complex where money is basically being extracted from communities straight out towards fossil fuel majors in like a one-way ticket, and moving towards a more distributed, decentralized, and more equitable form of energy generation where we're seeing more clean power plants from the communities where jobs and money can stay circulating within communities while also decarbonizing as well. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for that start. And in fact, the panel has already started with these interactions. What I'm going to do is work really from the large scale down to smaller scale questions and open with really a question about cities. What do you see currently providing the most opportunity to accelerate decarbonization? And can you point to any specific examples, specific cities, including, of course, Philadelphia?
Is that starting?
And you can take it in turn. Yeah, go ahead.
I think there is a lot of legislation out in cities. I think looking at Boston, and they're, building energy, different regulations, and then there's also, so they call it BERDA, that cute name for it, Building Energy Regulation Disclosure Ordinance. And then, New York, local law 97, there's a lot of different laws happening, Seattle, others. And so seeing what's going on in that space within municipalities, large cities, and how they're leading the way in that, it really makes a big difference. I think, a lot of this was energized around the Paris Accord and cities taking it upon themselves to try and meet the goals that were established during the Paris climate talks. So excited to see how that's progressing.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I think it's worth just spending a minute explaining the Climate Mobilization Act, which I think is the country's biggest, most comprehensive regulation for buildings, or Local Law 97 in New York. And there are a couple of things within Local Law 97 that I think do an amazing job of creating a very clear, very long-term pathway for decarbonization. And essentially the way Local Law 97 works is, one, it sets a price on carbon. So it sets a price of $268 per metric ton, and it puts a carbon cap on every single building greater than 25,000 square feet. And if you use more carbon than your carbon cap, then you get penalized at $268 a metric ton. But then what happens over time is really fascinating. Number one, over time, every 5 years or so, everyone's carbon caps slowly come down. So you have time to prepare for that. The other thing that happens is the carbon emissions that are embedded inside of the electric grid, they in a legislated way come down as well. So there's a very clear signal to the real estate community that, hey, by 2030, the electric grid carbon coefficient is going to be half of what it is today. We're doing our part by investing upstream in creating more and more clean electricity, and you should start to do your part in terms of electrifying building systems. And those are kind of like the big two things that need to happen in urban markets. Buildings need to, slowly but surely electrify their heat, or get rid of their other types of Scope 1 emissions. And then that electricity needs to be produced from increasingly renewable sources.
Yeah, I love Local Law 97. I think it's important to have a mix of carrots and sticks when trying to produce change. With Local Law 97 being an example of a stick, when you're financially penalized if you don't decarbonize by 40% by 2030. But also, I think it's really important to incentivize building owners and more to actually electrify. And something that we're focused on is basically looking at turning unused assets associated with buildings like rooftop spaces or parking lots into clean energy power plants that can also be a revenue generating source and service the local community and be part of like a larger virtual power plant and more. And by providing those opportunities of revenue, I think that's very important to incentivize the type of change that we need at this like infrastructural level.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the incentivization. One specific program that recently is in front of everyone right now is the Inflation Reduction Act. Really critical. Certainly there's lots of programs at cities that have been going on well before that, but we see it as a really important accelerant because it's on the order of $8.5 billion being pushed out directly for building electrification. So the way that cities, in my experience, are starting to figure out how to capture and deploy that money is a really critical strategy. First of all, because in many cases, there's many mayors out there that have made really public pronouncements about massive greenhouse gas reduction cuts that they're going to make by whatever threshold of date they're making, and then they have no idea how to get there at all, right? I mean, it's good PR, it's really needed to be able to kind of galvanize the effort and bring city departments together, but practically, what we experience is, you go to the sustainability department of a city and many of them that aren't maybe as large or as resourced will just be like one or two people being like, I have no idea even where to begin. So the first question is like, which buildings do we start with? And that's something that we can definitely help with. So, we have cities that we work with at all sizes, all over the country, and figuring out how to maximize their ability to deploy those funds is really critical, because in many cases, these electrification projects are not inherently yet economically profitable to make, right? In many cases, it's still cheaper to just keep burning that gas. So this subsidy, which depending on your income, which is another part of the city's really critical decision process, they're required to deploy 40% of the funds to low-income communities. So not only do they have to know a lot about the buildings, they have to know a lot about buildings in areas where they often don't have a lot of data. So what we try to do is help them figure out how to understand where to begin their marketing and outreach programs, and let people know that these funds are available, and maybe now some of these projects are more economically viable.
Yeah, and just one thing to add, I think that one of the elephants in the room that makes all of this also work is the utility, which is a quasi-regulated entity by the state. But all of these things that we're talking about, virtual power plants, distributed energy resources, solar, even electrifying buildings, you might need to make major changes to the electric grid infrastructure, the distribution network, your own electric service in your building, and then also the price of electricity. So to the point on gas versus electric, sure, you might have a carbon penalty associated with the gas, but the price gap between electricity and gas might be so big that people might say, hey, I'll take the penalty and burn the gas, then switch to electricity. And so a lot of that falls into the bucket of the utility, and they need to be a big player in helping create decarbonization as well.
Since we've landed so squarely on this question of electrification, I'm going to add a question in between here. You've mentioned price and of course the utility. What are some of the impediments you're encountering in electrifying buildings or in electrifying large parts of the city? And I'm thinking particularly multifamily housing, larger institutional and commercial kinds of buildings.
I can take that.
Sure.
Right now, for example, we are located on a campus next to the LA River that currently can't get enough power from the grid to service its tenants. And there's a lot of film shoots, for example, that happen there from Disney, FX, shows from Live Nation and more. And they just can't get the power there. It's taken them usually there's the biggest thing facing our energy grid right now is sorry, what's his name, David mentioned, is really with distribution and transmission lines. It's really costly, it's really expensive. So in order to solve for that, we've actually come in and we're starting to work on, we actually have a small proof of concept. It's what we're calling our creative community microgrid that is servicing that gap right now that we're using to fill up with batteries, inverters, from solar panel power that we then give and service for commercial applications, but then we also give for free to independent creatives and community orgs and more. But it's that kind of gap of these microgrid projects that can help service that current the capacity delta that we're facing overall. Yeah.
Yeah. Any physics majors in the audience? Yikes. So not shockingly, the most challenging buildings to electrify are the more very vertical buildings, especially vertical apartment buildings. A, not a lot of roof space for solar. B, the leading technology for heat pumps, air source heat pumps. There's a thing with the way heat pumps work, and you can probably explain this better than me. But you're really moving heat from outside into the building, and you need a certain amount of surface area in order to gather enough heat. And in very vertical buildings where you're sending high concentration of heat up the building to heat, it's very difficult for vertical buildings to implement an air source heat pump project. So there are certain laws of thermodynamics that the more vertical the building in urban markets, the harder.
Yeah, I'll echo that. There's certain technologies that just don't work over a certain height, for example, right? You just can't put a certain type of system 7 stories high just because of the physics of it. Another challenge within multifamily buildings in many cases is just the age of the building. Depending on the city, you're often dealing with really, really old neglected buildings that actually require a ton of envelope and efficiency improvements as well. So even if you electrify it and then you dump half of that improvement out the window, what's the point? And at the same time, you also then get into remediation needs. So you might find all kinds of hazardous materials from decades ago that are just buried away and no one dealt with it. And that's far too prevalent in many, especially of our low-income communities. So those make those challenges extra difficult. You have to do that remediation before you do the improvement. It just raises the cost of the project. Still certainly things that need to happen. It just kind of increases that barrier.
Yeah, I recently heard that the energy coordinating agency here in Philadelphia, which does low-income, mostly row house energy audits and renovation, has to turn down 50% of the houses that they audit because there's some pre-existing, mostly leaking roof condition that makes it impossible to. So reinforcing the point. Okay, moving on to the next question. What would you say is the best and most underrated technique or technology for decarbonization? And can you provide an example of what you see as the most impactful piece, or one that you'd like to invent? If you're...
I think for me, like, you know, what was just said here, specifically around like electrification, moving in that direction, I think like weatherization is very underrated. It is the least expensive a lot of times way to go in things. So I think like conservation is something that we should be thriving for and reducing first and then electrifying after, if that's the goal. And so like, you know, if that's the proper solution for that house, but then there's other potential issues that go into that. So I think like really weatherization is the big one.
I would agree with weatherization. I would say for the price to value, you can save, you know, many percentage points with, you know, literally a few $100s worth of tape. It's like really incredible what you can do. It does take humans to go into those buildings and install it, but it's really, really efficient. Heat pumps is the one that hits near and dear to me because the heating system is by far the most carbon and the most energy that's burned in any building. Though I don't know if I'd say at this point they're underrated. Maybe that's my own echo chamber at this point, but I hear enough about them. I don't know if that means that they're certainly not at the scale we want them to be. But that maybe today it's not quite so underrated. And then the overrated one, I feel like this is a trick question, but I feel like there's two sides to this, but electric stoves are way overrated in the net impact against total energy usage of a building, but they are not underrated in terms of the health impacts. So they certainly have, we now know that there's, you know, upwards of say 16+% of childhood asthma is caused by gas stoves, is what the most recent research we've seen. I think that is crazy. So it is absolutely a massive hit on our communities, but from an energy usage perspective, they don't contribute all that much.
Yeah, I think that one of the most underrated strategies is a combination of access to high quality data, and I'll talk about what kind of data I mean, and training. Training building operators or energy users on how to use that data in a smart way. And even today, like I don't know what the percentage would be, but I say that the vast majority of buildings are generally operating from an energy data blind perspective. People who run buildings don't necessarily know in real time how much electricity, how much gas is the building using right now. How do I translate that electricity and that gas or that steam into the carbon emissions metrics, depending on what's happening on the grid? And there's a massive amount of progress that can be made with access to that information and training and incentives for the folks who are running buildings to run those buildings more efficiently.
So 87% of emissions are energy related, so really interested in any technology surrounding that. And I think solar is a very underrated technology actually, which is at a beautiful inflection point right now where the cost of solar generation is far below that of fossil fuel generation. And the challenge we're facing right now, as stated earlier, is really the deployment of that. And so any technology that can help us get past the transmission problem and work in like a wireless way is what really gets me out of bed. And when I mean wireless, I mean working around the constraints of the grid, working around the constraints of high voltage lines, and really working more locally. So I think you brought up like virtual power plants as an example. So that area, incredible. Just to like say it in other words, a VPP really is, think about like a large utility that has to service a load size of like 10,000 megawatts. That could be serviced by 10 large power plants, or it could be serviced by 10,000 smaller sources like EVs, smart thermostats, solar, battery storage. That's distributed all across, but then harnessed in a really intelligent way to deliver power when and where it needs to go. And it doesn't require huge infrastructural changes to do at all. And I think the Department of Energy recently put out a study that showed that if we could triple VPP generation or capacity from 80 gigawatts to, I think, 160 gigawatts by 2030, it could save ratepayers $100 billion, I'm pretty sure, a year. It's wild, like how much it could save. But that type of technology where we're working smart and more locally is, much needed in this fight to electrify.
And actually, Christina, I'm going to take you back to your introduction. You mentioned microgrids,
Yes.
which I think was probably second on your list of technologies that you were. Could you explain those a little bit?
Yeah, think about a microgrid as like a mini grid that could be connected or disconnected from the larger grid. You have a generation source, think like photovoltaic panels, you have battery storage, you have your load. Like that in itself is like a little grid. And the idea is to create more of these all across our city that could be independently owned, and then harness once again in that intelligent way with like that cloud-based software to then not only decarbonize, but also help people make money closer to home.
And going back to utility infrastructure for a second, the whole electric grid has really been designed for electricity to flow in one direction. From many miles outside of cities where you produce that power to the flowing to the use source. And one of the challenges is that when you do build microgrids and you build VPPs, it's easy to put on paper that like electricity is now flowing in all these different directions. But in practice, there's very real, very local distribution challenges. And there are issues like, for example, if you have a microgrid and there could be times where you're exporting to the grid, but maybe the utility transformer that's down the block from your building can't handle electricity flowing in that direction. And so there's very real challenges, very real local and also large scale distribution issues in terms of really facilitating the development of this marketplace.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that there's definitely challenges, but there's definitely a lot of pilot programs that have been proven very successful with this bidirectional charging. And there's also other solutions that we're working on as well, where we're actually working on distributing power in a mobile way, actually taking advantage of the battery technology that exists right now, filling up with solar during the day when it's not needed, and actually delivering it on wheels to where it needs to go. So we're working a bit more of an off-grid capacity, and that's always been the way we've approached things. And through that, have been finding these solution sets that are really interesting and much needed for these different applications. But yeah, there's definitely, it's a fun challenge to solve overall with a lot of different solutions.
So that's grid, microgrid, and grid on wheels?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay, I'm going to shift another scale down. At the building level, we often hear about the distinction between operational emissions and embodied carbon emissions. Can you discuss the nuances between them? Why action on one might be more prevalent than the other, meaning why is dealing with embodied carbon emissions so difficult in India?
Sure, I can start. We focus explicitly on the in-building emissions, so I don't have a ton to say about the embodied emissions, but one of the reasons why we do it is because 125 million buildings already exist. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that, and most of them aren't going anywhere for any foreseeable future. So the reality is we literally have to flip every single building in the entire country and then do that in other countries to make them electric. And it's going to take a lot of time and effort. And additionally, I would say a lot of the timelines of these decisions are really long duration timelines. So you only replace your heating system, at most every 15 years, sometimes 30 plus. So if you make a decision today, you're not going to have a chance to go back on it for many, many years. So it's really, really critical that we start to do this fast, and those options are available when furnaces fail. The other piece is that most people only replace those key heating systems because of the cost, for obvious reasons, when they are at end of life. Nobody's really proactively throwing away a system that currently works because you don't need to. You don't need to spend the money. So what that practically means, though, is that you're always in a desperate spot. It's in the middle of winter, your furnace fails, and you just say, "I need something immediately." And if the contractor has a gas furnace on his truck and he says, "I can put this in today," you usually say, "Okay." It's a really tough spot, and then again, you're locked in. So from a long-term impact perspective, these decisions today really matter. And there's millions of them happening every single year.
Could I just ask one of you to explain to the audience what embodied carbon emissions are in case people don't know?
I could take a stab at it. So I don't know the exact math, but I think that if you look at the long-term operational life of a building, like 30 or 40% of the carbon emissions related to that building are embodied carbon emissions, which is all of the carbon that goes into creating that building. It's easy to forget how big that number is until you walk past a construction site for a large building. Just think about how, all of those materials, how they were made, how the steel was made, how it was all transported to the site, just all of the energy and carbon that goes into building a building. And I think it's amazing on the operational side, just all of I think at this point, probably most of major urban markets in the US have some form of benchmarking standard where all operational carbon emissions are, as a starting point, now being benchmarked. And so the way to drive progress is to create a standard and then chip away at those metrics. And there's been amazing progress made on operational carbon. So the next step for embodied carbon, the first thing you have to do is you have to measure it. How do you figure out how much carbon has actually gone into the building of a building? So I think the first step there is figuring out what that number is, because then you can start to chip away at it.
I will point out just in that example you gave about lots of buildings, in fact, existing buildings exist, right? It's the fact that's in front of us. So one, it's an argument. This embodied carbon is an argument for keeping or repairing or renovating that existing building. But even in the example you gave of do I replace my furnace with a heat pump and why do I wait into it? There is embodied carbon in those devices. Same thing with your automobile, right? There's a whole bunch of sunk carbon, if you will, in an automobile. So the question is, should I trash that sunk carbon and then buy a new electric vehicle today, or is there a benefit? So it's exactly that same calculation. Okay, let me move to next question. How does access and availability, or lack thereof, of emissions and energy usage data drive technology innovation in the decarbonization space? What are some challenges? Everybody here has already opened the door to that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a setup for the pitch for logical buildings. But yeah, I mean, I think that, for us, like I mentioned, what we view one of our major roles in decarbonization is helping not only buildings, but also, single family homes, small, medium businesses, helping the built world use less energy all the time. Which in a major way starts with data and information. There's a cliche saying, which is you can't manage what you can't measure, and so it starts with some form of granular data measure, access to data, continuous access to data, inexpensive access to data. It should not be cost prohibitive to figure out your hourly electricity and gas usage. So a lot of that falls on the utility. So access to that data for the sake of using less all of the time. And then I would say also access to that data for using energy more intelligently. Half of the value of energy in terms of what you actually pay for is the when, as opposed to the how much. So much of energy, specifically electricity, the value is related to time of use, how much carbon is in the grid at different times. Oftentimes, during overnight baseload periods, you might have zero carbon in the grid, and your baseload electricity could be supplied exclusively from hydro, nuclear, wind, and then during peak hours, that electricity is super carbon intense. Time of use, extremely important in energy use and carbon emissions reduction. So access to that data and intelligence around how to use that, whether it's through a smart thermostat, solar plus storage, or just through nudging of people to make better decisions.
Yeah, so I'll talk about a few different categories. This is exactly the core issue in many of the decisions that are being made, is you don't often know enough to make a fully informed decision. So from a what we do and don't know perspective, I'll start with building characteristics. So generally, there are tax assessor databases that are available, some of which are public, many cities of which have released a lot of tax assessor data publicly. Usually the bigger the city, the more transparent they are about their tax assessment data. So you can get a lot of information about the physical structure of a building through those sources. Some of the things that are unfortunately not as detailed as we would like them to be in those data sets are things like, what is the heating system and heating fuel being used in that building right now? So you usually get dimensional, spatial, age, things like that, which are super helpful, but if you don't know what is currently being used to power it, you can't really model it very well. So then what you do is you go to the next level, and then you go to permit data. A lot of the same kind of thing, different depths of availability, but permit data can be a great source to see if somebody filed a permit to replace that heating system or did some sort of upgrade. Though they're not comprehensive and always reliable, and in many places, especially rural places, you don't have access to any of it. So you kind of then cobble that together. And then the third category, which is kind of at the real crux of it all, is the energy usage itself, which is dependent on the utilities. And my experience is you get kind of effectively two approaches to the availability of that data. You have utilities that are both gas and electric providers, generally are going to be more open to helping decarbonize because they know that the revenue just shifts from one pocket to the other. Seems reasonable, and they're like, okay, I don't mind sharing this with you, because they may have even been given a charge by a city or state government that they have to implement these kinds of electrification policies. The utilities that are solely gas, and it means that you're trying to move basically customers away from them, just shut the door completely and say no chance, privacy, or whatever they want to claim is the reason. They say it's for like business secrets. They don't want people to know how much energy is being used by a business. Clearly, in my mind, it's just that they don't want people to know how much they're being charged and be public about that to be able to move off of it. So you have like really, really difficult entrenched interests, all having different reasons and resources to share some parts of the data. But if in the places where you can fuse all that together, it actually becomes a lot clearer and a lot easier how to make decisions that are really, really beneficial. So it's a struggle, we're working on it, but actually, and then the final piece I'd layer onto it is we're actually in a really interesting age right now where you can literally just throw a huge amount of data from a whole bunch of sources together and let AI come back with pretty interesting things. Not that solves all the problems, but like it is a big data problem, and these are massive data sources that we have available. Again, not comprehensively everywhere, but we have the ability to do this in a much, much more efficient way than we ever have even a couple years ago. And that's only going to improve massively. So one of the projects that I'm working on, have worked on, was, I mentioned at the beginning, my goal is to get every single building knowledge about it, energy usage, model it out. We did this with Oak Ridge National Labs. We literally modeled every single building in the whole country with as much data as we could come together. And we released it publicly with Georgetown's Massive Data Institute. So we released the energy efficiency potential, the EUI, basic characteristics of the buildings. It's step one. Again, it's not all the way, it's not all energy usage. We want to get there, but we need to be more public about it. We need to be more transparent about it. The more people that can have this information in their hands, the better decisions we can make.
I think too, in adding to that, and we've talked about benchmarking ordinances and disclosures across the country. And I think one of the other things too is making the data digestible. And so what I really like is the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool. It scores buildings compared nationally with other buildings in its class, and so that's like a really helpful way to kind of communicate, the energy use intensity and how the building is performing overall compared to others. So like I think taking the data and being able to generate some kind of report or score is very helpful.
I have a question for a city data manager. What would be if you could have your druthers, what would be your optimal group of buildings that you would want to know their energy usage about? Like, how would you set the thresholds or criteria for which building should be reporting on how much energy they use?
I mean, I think the bigger the building, the more interest in knowing how it's performing. And I think like going across the portfolio right now, we're 50,000 square feet in our ordinance, which is other cities are a bit lower. But I think like 50,000, I feel is definitely great to get that sense of large buildings. And so beyond that, very interesting. I think it's like it comes to a matter of size, right? If you're talking small buildings, they're going to be using a lot less, and then there's a lot more work into gathering all of that information. And so I think like going like with looking at large buildings and how they're performing, I think is yeah. I don't know if I have a number.
No, that's fine. We really appreciate when cities are public about this data, right? This is like the first source that we go to is these benchmarking databases. They're gold, so they're great.
Christina, do you have an answer? No.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of the energy issue can kind of be reduced simply down to matching load to generation in real time and solving for that. And in order to design the solutions for that, you do need the data to do it. And one way that's very tangible in the way we approach it is like when we were looking to get rid of fossil fuel generators on our productions, you couldn't just go in there and do that, because what we realized that no one had ever actually converted the paradigm of gallons of diesel to kilowatt hours. And in order for us to design those solutions, we had to actually go out and individually meter generators at different productions at the Hollywood Bowl, with Live Nation, with Amazon Web Services. And we actually went out and would meter down to the 10-second interval over like a month-long period of time. And that's a lot of data that you have to aggregate. But only then were we able to like understand like the unique energy profiles, like these huge dynamic peaks and curves. And then from there actually come to the table to figure out the right solution for that. And I think, especially with the advent, once again, of like VVPs and more, like there's so much potential now to match these different types of loads to different types of generation that aren't always located right behind the meter at the same spot. So the more data we can get to do that, the more elegant the solutions can be for that, and using AI and more to design more financially viable developments and the right technology to go more wireless.
And just to double down on that, that data is not only important for the real-time balancing of supply and demand, which is, you need it, but there's an even more basic use, which is the accounting system of the energy marketplace. And so if you are doing, if you do have these great strategies around load matching or, EV charging at smarter times, if the utility doesn't know that you did it, you can get financial credit for it. And so that data is super valuable for all of the load matching, but even at a more basic level as a system of accounting for making sure that the producers and consumers are paying for energy based on the right price, which is all time dependent.
Excellent. I'm going to turn in a second to the audience for their questions, but you actually have partially answered the question that I was formulating as you were talking, because we heard on the one hand, I laugh every time I see a science fiction movie in which, the smart girl in the van with a laptop is able to instantly bring up a three-dimensional diagram of the building that whoever is inside with, they know where everything is and can connect everything. I can tell you as an architect, even the design drawings don't describe the building that it's building. And clients actually have to pay extra to get an as-built drawing to describe the building that exists. So that information does, so that's one huge scale of it. Then you talked about EUI, which is an annual energy per unit of area measure, useful for what you described, benchmarking and so forth, but doesn't tell you much more than my building is, here relative to other buildings. And then we get down to, what did you say, 10-second interval? So where in that spectrum, do you find the most utility, and when are we simply drowning in data? Like, when is it too much?
Yes. So I think that I'd say like 15 to 60 minute data is very important as a system of accounting. And the way that almost every utility in the world bills people when it comes to time of use is related to things like 2 contiguous 15-minute peaks of usage. And so 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, these are all very important units of measurement in terms of an accounting system for energy marketplace. When you're at the microgrid trying to optimize dispatch, then you really do need to have systems that that work at the 6-second, 8-second level. So you need different frequencies of data and for different purposes. But I'd say putting aside optimizing the dispatch of a microgrid, probably 5, 15 minute or 60 minute level data.
I'll resist the urge to keep geeking out with my, I can get to that later. But let me open this up for questions from the audience. Please.
Hi, thank you so much.
You want to give
My question is, something that was mentioned was reducing the use of energy needed, but thank you. My question was, reducing the use of energy used requires data, and data is run on cloud systems, and there's huge data warehouses, and the more data you use, the more data warehouses you need, and these big buildings that are using, so it kind of sounds like an optimization problem, and I was wondering if you have an idea of the scale of that, and if there's a way to also reduce and optimize how much data is being used in the world in order to not be using too much energy for that.
So that basically by storing all this data, we're using more servers that are burning more energy.
Exactly.
I'd say that a lot of times the data that's actually being collected for these things is so small. The actual file size is very, very tiny, very different than personal iCloud with gigabytes of photos and videos and stuff like that. So typically this stuff, unless you're doing a 3D model of a streaming video of a tour walkthrough, but typically the data that we're collecting is very tiny.
Yeah, I think something else that's interesting as well is that data centers and the energy that's required to service them has actually spurred private companies and technology companies like Google, for example, to actually invest in renewable energy generation and invest in programs like these virtual power plants that can then benefit local communities, where they're putting up the upfront cost that's required for that transition, but then the local community to that can actually benefit from it as well. So it's interesting to see how the private sector and these corporate sectors have moved to agilely move where public sectors are a little bit slower and not as incentivized to do so, but through the use of data.
Yeah, and I would be much more concerned about things like how much power AI uses, crypto mining. I'll tell you just a quick story, a little bit scary, but I was at a conference in Austin a couple months ago. And I forgot the name of the utility in Austin, but they opened up with a little quiz. And they said, what do you think is contributing most to load growth in Texas today? Okay. And it was A, population growth, a lot of people moving to Texas. B, EV charging, a lot more EVs on the road. And 3, crypto mining. Okay. and people put in their guesses. The answer is C, and it's not even close. The amount, I think in Texas right now, there's like 3 New York cities worth of electricity of crypto mining facilities that are in queue to be developed. Like they've been approved, but they're just like in queue to be developed. So like the scale of that is pretty massive.
So, I saw your hand come up next.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kind of on that note, and I know we mentioned that there's still a lot of old buildings that we have to talk about and address the operational carbon for those, but obviously there's still new construction happening. And David, you mentioned a strategy for how we're going to tackle that problem can maybe emulate what we did for operational carbon, where you set benchmarks and then chip away at those. So I wanted to hear, like, is there going to be a shift from like operational to embodied carbon, and like when do you think that will happen? Like, are we reaching a limit on the progress that we've made on reducing operational carbon?
We definitely have not reached that limit, and I don't think we will for a very long time. So certainly embodied carbon could be elevated as well, but I don't necessarily see it as a shift from one to the other. I think both are going to continue to be important because both are major contributors.
Yeah, and not to pick on your neighbor in New Jersey, but but New Jersey just for the first time is starting benchmarking of energy data for buildings that are 25,000 square feet and above. And in New Jersey, that's 12,000 buildings that newly fall into that benchmarking requirement. So there's still a lot of basic work to do.
I'd say, that's a really interesting question. I think looking at where the market is going for things like LEED certification, so like leadership through energy and environmental design, they have a pilot for version 5 for operations and maintenance right now. I'm building BD&C, building design and construction. A lot of acronyms in this space, but that's forthcoming, and I think that they're really going to dive deeper into embodied carbon in the building space, and so that usually, those kind of certifications, those kind of markers are really helpful in seeing where the industry is going.
And I'll just add, for a new building, if you're being ambitious and, net zero is an easy, particularly if we're talking about houses, but net zero is an easy first target, and one can be more extreme than that. The minute you get to those levels of operational energy, and if you're at net zero carbon, then embodied carbon becomes hugely important. So it's very much, it's on the, architects love it because it involves the materials of the building, and so seems more directly related to their work. But the minute, you shift to new buildings, it does become very important.
Wait, when you say net zero here, you mean just operational, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah. And by the way, that's why, the building being built right here has a wood structure. That wouldn't have happened even 3 or 4 years ago. Let's see, next question. I
have a quick
go
question.
To the direct.
When you see the headlines that the Super Bowl is being 100% powered by solar power, on the spectrum of, oh my God, how cool, to, oh my God, leave me alone, where do you fall? What's your reaction?
I'll answer. I feel like that is a good indicator overall, but there's a lot of greenwashing in this space for sure, where it's not actually directly powered by the renewable energy. Once again, it's a lot of accounting magic, but at the same time, that kind of accounting also spurs investment in the renewable space. So it's kind of like a delicate balance, but I do appreciate initiatives like that because it does, once again, service the larger goal that I think some of you mentioned of having consumers become more energy conscious and really trying to understand where their energy is coming from and more. So it's double-sided. I can't say it's all good or all bad, but overall, a great step in the right direction. And there's so much underutilized space at these arenas and more to become renewable energy generation assets for the larger community. So, yeah.
But fun fact, does anyone want to guess what the most energy efficient day of the year is? typically the Super Bowl because everybody's watching together. So there is some benefit to, even though they should market that.
It's also the biggest load on the sewage system. The halftime break is the single biggest pulse on the sewage system. Let's see, another question. Yeah, back here.
So thinking about this concept of carbon being, carbon neutral, carbon zero, whatever it is, there are standards that companies can follow where you go through a checklist and you do these things and you can claim that you are carbon neutral. And that often involves things like carbon credits, and it doesn't necessarily take everything. When you really start to dive into it, there's a lot of gaps in these analyses, but then a company could put a stamp on their logo and say we are carbon neutral. So I'm very skeptical of the concept of carbon neutral at this point because I feel like we just can't get into it. There's so many levels of it that when you really start to look at it. So I think my question really is, do you think that being carbon zero in our current society is possible? And what would have to change between now and the future that would make carbon neutrality achievable?
Yeah, I mean, I think without getting too meta on this, carbon accounting is very, very hard. So I think that's like really the crux of it. And if you believe that emitting carbon in and of itself is not a sin, but that if you're emitting carbon, on your left hand, but you're sucking it out of the air with your right hand, that is net zero. I think really comes down to like standardization of carbon accounting, which is a major challenge, especially for things like nature-based offsets. Like if I, plant a tree in my backyard, have I now created a carbon credit that I can sell to my friend? So that I view as the crux of it.
Yeah, one of the things right now that I think plagues the carbon markets is the concept of avoided emissions is, because they're voluntary, you can say that I could have done something and I'm going to claim a carbon credit for it, but maybe you were never going to do it in the first place. So it just completely delegitimizes the whole argument, right? If you're actually physically pulling carbon out of the air and you can somehow measure that, which is insanely difficult to account for, at least you're doing something real. But hypothetical avoided emissions, I think, have factored into that, and many use those numbers because they're cheaper credits. They're less viable, but then you put that stamp of approval for marketing purposes. So we're getting there. We need to do a lot more of actually pulling carbon out of the air, which those technologies are relatively young at this point, but we need to do a lot more of that. But it's a difficult problem for the carbon credit market right now. Is just legitimacy of it, because historically it hasn't actually been that viable. Even in the places where you're doing tree planting, and then we find out that it was totally horribly estimated, and and those are actually tangible projects. So it could be possible. One other kind of caveat I'll throw in here is even from our perspective, if we're looking at these buildings and we say, okay, we can get a building to fully electric, that is a hugely difficult achievement. But if your source of electricity is still carbon heavy, then we just move to electric, but it's more efficient and it's certainly a better progress. But we can't fully control that without turning the power plants electric, to clean electric as well. So it's some of what you can control is very much achievable, and some of what you can't control is systemic. So.
Yeah, and I feel like just going back to the whole claiming net zero, I think so much of that is driven by consumer demand, and consumers are getting smarter. And I was just talking to a friend of mine who's the director of sustainability for LA28, or the Olympics in LA, and she said, after the whole Delta scandal, their carbon credit system is just not right, and they're being called out for that. They started moving away from just looking at carbon offset credits and starting to look at investing in a more long-term infrastructure for the local community, for example. So I think we're going to start seeing trends kind of moving away from just this glossy term or number. And yeah, so we'll see how things continue to shift.
And I'll just add, if you're interested in the controversy over or a strong opinion on offsets, Joe Rahm at the Penn Center for Climate Communication just wrote a great white paper on it. And the simple conclusion, there's lots of good detail, but the simple conclusion was you get what you pay for. If you're buying a $5 offset, you're probably not doing anything. I mean, look at the EPA has set it at what, $175. You know, if you're not paying something close to that cost of carbon, the offset's probably meaningless. How are we doing at time? Okay, I'm sorry we have to wrap it up. You're welcome to come up and have at the panel. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you to the panel.